In this tutorial, we're going to see how to create a simple application, simple CRUD application with authentication that uses React.js and Firebase for the backend. So as you can see, when the user loads the application, they can either log in or sign up. So they can choose here if they want to log in or sign up. Then they can create an account. So they need to provide an email and the password. Let's quickly do that. And after filling in the details, I can sign up. And I can see that the application immediately updates and is now showing the to-do items, the to-dos for this specific user, the user that is now logged in. From this page, they can add to-dos. So let's try to add a to-do, say watch news. Then I can click on add to-do and the to-do item is immediately added. Let's try to add another one, say do homework, and let's add this one as well, and it was added to the list. Now, the nice thing is that the to-dos are personalized. So if I now sign out from this account and log in with a different account, so this is going to be Bubu2, not Bubu. And let's log in with this account, and you can see that this user doesn't have any to-dos. So the to-dos of this user are completely separate from the to-dos of the other user. So let's say that this user adds watch TV, and let's add this to-do, and this user now has its own list. Let's add another one, say eat lunch, and let's add this one as well. And now that I have my list, I can mark any of the to-do items as completed, say this one, and immediately we can see a line through the text of this element. In addition, we have the deletion icon to the right of each of the elements, and if I want to delete any of the elements, I just need to click on the icon and it is immediately removed. Let's dive right in and see how to implement it. In this tutorial, we will see how to create an entire React.js application with Firebase as the backend, and we will be covering authentication, the full CRUD operation set, and also personalized data. So different users can have different data. In a minute, we will create our React application, but I want to start with creating the Firebase project. So let's open the web browser. And here we need to go to console.firebase.google.com. console.firebase.google.com. And let's create a new Firebase project. And I'm going to name it React Firebase. I will uncheck this option and continue. I don't want to enable Gemini, so I'll turn this off and continue. And also I don't want analytics, so let's also turn this off and create project. And the Firebase project is being created and it's done. Let's continue. So the first thing we need to do is to add an app, and we can do that right from here. So let's add app, and this is of course going to be a web application because we're going to use React. So let's choose this option that says web. We need to give a nickname to our application. I'm going to call it React Client, and let's register app. Next, we need to install Firebase, and this is something that we need to do in the folder of our application. So now is a good time to create our React application. To do that, I'm going to use vit. So npm create vit. And this will create our new application. I need to give a name to my project. I call it React Firebase. That's fine. For the framework, I choose React, and I'm going to go with JavaScript. So let's choose that, and let's install with npm and start now. So it's creating the project, and the developer server is running, but I'm going to stop it for a minute. And let's open the folder of the new project. And from this folder, we can run this. So npm install Firebase. Let me copy it and paste it here, and let's run it. And Firebase was installed in our project. Let's open it in Visual Studio Code. It might be a bit more convenient. So code dot for the current folder. And if we take a look at package.json, we can see that we now have Firebase among our dependencies. Next, we need this content. And this is something that I want in a dedicated file. So first, I'm going to create here a folder, and I'm going to call it config. So make directory, and I want it in my source folder, and I'm going to call it config. And it was created. We can see it here. Here it is, config. And in my config folder, I want a new file, and I'm going to call it firebase.js. So in the source folder, in the config folder, let's create firebase.js. And it was created, and I'm just going to copy the code from here and paste it in our new firebase.js file. And this is the initialization that we need in our React application to connect to the Firebase project. And as you can see the API key and all of the details that are needed to connect to the Firebase project. But this is not going to be enough on its own. From Firebase, we are going to use two abilities, and these are going to be authentication and database. So from this file, I want to export these two. To start working with Firebase authentication, we need to call get auth. So let's try to do that, get auth. And as you can see, it was found in Firebase auth. So let's choose that, and we need to import it from Firebase auth. So here, I'm going to import get auth And as a parameter to get auth, we need to pass app. And I'm going to store it in a variable that I'm simply going to call auth. And in a very similar fashion, we also want to work with the Firebase database. And this is something we can do using the function get Firestore. So get Firestore, and this can be found in Firebase/Firestore. So let's import it, and we're now importing get Firestore. Here it is. And as a parameter, I'm going to pass app, and I'm going to store it in a constant called db. And now that I have both auth and db, let's export both of them. So export auth and db. Okay, so now that we're done with that, let's continue to console here on Firebase, continue to console. And we can see that now we have our app that we just defined. This is our React client. Let's now go back to the code of the application, and let's open our main file, app.jsx. Here it is. And maybe we can start the development server. So npm run dev, and let's see how it looks like. So we can see the code, and we can also see the application itself running in the browser. Now let me get rid of all of the example template code. So I'll delete all of this code, and we don't need these two imports. Let's remove these two lines. And the first thing we're going to focus on is how to work with a Firebase database, which is Firestore. So let's go back to Firebase. And here on the left side, I'm going to click on build. And here we're going to choose Firestore database. So let's choose this option. So to initialize Firestore in our Firebase project, we need to create database. So let's click on it, create database, and I'm going to go with a standard edition. So next. Then we need to choose a location, and the idea is to choose a location that's as close as possible to the majority of your users. So next. And here I'm going to start in test mode. Starting in production mode would require us to configure Firestore rules right from the beginning. And I want to focus on working with Firestore rather than configuring its rules. So for simplicity, we're going to start in test mode. And let's create. And our database was created. Let's go back to our application. And I want to access Firestore from a different component. So let's start by creating this new component. So in my source folder, I'm going to create it, and I'm just going to call it todos.jsx. And here the new file was created. So let's start by defining this new component. Now, you might remember this file, the one that we configured in the config folder, and we called firebase.js. Let's open it. And in this file, you might remember this constant, db. This is what we need to actually work with Firestore, with the Firebase database. So the first thing I'm going to do in my TODOs file is import db. So let's do that, import db, and here it is. And now I want to go back to Firebase on the website. And in the Firestore database, I want to create a new collection. So let's start collection. And we need to give a name to the new collection. I'm going to call it TODOs. So let's click on next. And we need to initialize it with the first document. And to do that, the document needs to have an ID and it needs to have data. So for the ID, I'm going to go with auto ID, and this will generate an ID automatically for this new document. And since this is going to represent a to-do item, for the key of the field, I'm going to go with title. And let's say that the value is going to be feed the dog. I can now click on save, and the new document was saved to our to-dos collection. So here we can see to-dos. And in the to-dos collection, we can see that we have one document. This is the ID of the document. And here we can see the data of this specific document. And at the moment, it only contains one field where the key is title and the value is feed the dog. Let's now see how to fetch this value in the application. So the first thing we're going to need is a collection reference. And this is the reference to the collection we just created. So to create the collection reference, we are going to use the collection function. And we can see that it can be found in Firebase Firestore. So let's choose this option. And we can see that it was also imported from Firebase Firestore. Now, as a parameter to this function, we first need to pass db, which is exactly this, what we imported from our configuration file. And the second parameter is the name of the collection. So the name of our collection is TODOs, and this is exactly what I'm going to pass here as the second parameter. And let's store it in a constant called TODO collection reference. Next, I want to have here a button so that we can click on it and actually fetch the information. So let's create a new button. And this is, of course, what we're going to return from this component. And I want the text of this button to be get TODOs. And now we need to bind the callback to the onClick event of this button. So onClick, and to fetch the documents of a collection, we're going to use the getDocs function. So getDocs, and this is of course also something from Firebase Firestore. So this is the one that we're going to use, and it was imported, of course. And as a parameter to this function, we need to pass the collection reference, which is exactly this, TODO collection reference. So let's pass this as the parameter. And getDocs is an asynchronous function, and this is why here I'm going to add a await. And since we are now using await, I'm going to wrap it inside an asynchronous function. So here I'm going to add async. And let's store the value returned from getDocs in a constant called collection data. And let's start simple by simply logging the data that we fetched. And of course, if I want this component to do anything, I need to use it in my main component in app.jsx. So here I'm going to add a call to TODOs. Here it is. And of course, an import to this component was added. And we can now see the button that we defined in the getToDos component. Let's now open the developer tools and let's try clicking on the button. And we can see that we got back an object called query snapshot. But what we are really interested in is the documents in this collection. So to do that, to access the actual documents, we need to add here .docs. And this will retrieve the actual documents. So let's try again. Let me click on the button again. And you can see that now we have query documents snapshot. And if we expand it, we can see that at the moment it only contains one document. Let's go back to the database and let's try to add another document. So let me click here where it says add document. And once again, I'm going to auto-generate an ID. The key of the field is going to be title. And let's say that this is going to be feed the cat. So let's save this document. And let's go back to the application. And let me refresh the page and click on the button. And now we got back an array containing two objects, because now our collection contains two documents. Let's try to take it one step further and actually display here the titles of the to-do documents. So let me start by defining a state for the documents. And now I want to return something in addition to the button, so let's wrap it in another containing element. Now, as you can see, the elements that we retrieved from the database are quite complicated. We have here quite a lot of information, and we're not actually going to use all of it in our React application. So from this complicated object, let me extract the information that we're actually going to need. So let me define here a to-dos array. And this is something that we're going to extract from the documents, but is not going to contain all of the information from the documents, only the information that we're actually going to use. So I'm going to start by accessing the documents, and once again, this can be done using the collection data .docs, and these are the actual documents. And now I want to go over the documents one by one and extract the relevant data from each of them. To do that, I'm going to use .map. Map expects a callback as a parameter, and the parameter to this callback is the element that we're going over right now. So let's call it doc for the current document. And in the array that we're building, I want to represent this document as a new object. So let's create here an object, and let's start with a single field where the key is going to be title. And to access the data of this document, we need to write doc, which is the document, .data. And now we need to specify the key of the field that we are extracting. And it has to match the key that's defined in Firestore. So since here in Firestore, the key is called title, this is also what I'm going to write in my code. So here we need to write title. And this way we are building a new array containing the actual data, the actual titles for each of the documents in the collection. Now that we have this array, we can use it to update our state. So let's call setToDos, and as a parameter, we're going to pass the array that we just built. Now we're going to use the TODOs array from our state to build divs. One div for each element. So TODOs, and once again, we're going to use map to convert the to-do elements to an array of divs. So TODOs.map, and once again, as a parameter, we need to pass a callback, and the parameter of the callback is the element that we're going over right now. Let's call it to-do. And for this to-do, we want to return a new div, and it's simply going to show the title of the current to-do element. So to-do.title. And of course, this is JavaScript code, so it has to be in curly braces. And let's add an import for useState. Here it is. But the problem that we're facing now is that when the page loads, when this component loads, TODOs is going to be null. Because this is the initialization value, right? Here we define the state, and the initial value of TODOs is going to be null. It can update later after we click on the button, because we have this line, set TODOs. But when this component just loads, TODOs is going to be null. It's going to give us problems, because here we're trying to run .map on it, and this is something that we can only do for arrays, but not for null. So let's start by checking if TODOs is null. And if it is null, I'm simply going to show loading. Otherwise, we know that we have an actual array, and then we can go over its elements. So now, when the component loads, we can see here loading. But if we click on the button, we can see that the actual elements were retrieved from Firebase, from Firestore, and now we can see their titles. Now, we can see that we got here a warning or a problem. And it says that each child in a list should have a unique key prop. This is a common problem in React. Whenever we are using map to create a lot of children to the same element, just like we created here a lot of divs for the different to-do items, each of them needs to have a key attribute, and it needs to have a different value. So here is how we're going to solve it. You might remember that each of the documents has its own ID, and the IDs are of course unique. So we are going to use these IDs, the IDs of the different documents, to decide the values for the key attribute. So first, on top of the title, I'm also going to extract the ID of the document for each of the documents. So here in the object that we are building, we're going to add another field, and it's going to be ID, and its value is going to be doc.id. This way we can retrieve the ID of the document. Now that we have an ID for each document, we are going to use it when building the divs. So here I'm going to add the key attribute, and the value is going to be the ID of the current to-do item. So todo.id. And let's remove this log. Next, instead of loading, I want to show here a loading spinner. So I already have a small GIF for that, and let me paste it to my public folder. Okay, I copied it, and now instead of loading, I'm going to use this GIF, and let's import it from the GIF file. And now we can see here the loading spinner until we click on the button, and then it is replaced by the actual to-do items. Now I want to take one more case into account, and this is the case where we loaded the documents from the collection, but we couldn't find any documents. Because right now, if we're going back to Firestore, and let me remove the documents that we currently have. So let's delete this document, and also delete this one, so delete document. So now we have a collection, but we don't have any documents. And let's refresh the page again, and we can see our loading spinner. Now I'm going to click on the button, and the loading spinner is gone, but we cannot see here anything. So to make it a bit clearer, I want to give a clear indication to the user that we loaded the data, but no to-do items could be found. So here, if the length of the fetched array, so todos.length, is 0, we're going to show a div that says that no to-dos could be found. Otherwise, we're going to actually show the to-do item. So let's try again, and let's refresh the page, and let's click on the button again. And now it explicitly says that no to-dos were found. Now I want the to-do items to be shown as soon as this component loads, right? Because right now we have to click on the button and then they load, but I want them to load as soon as the component loads. So to do that, we can use useEffect. So here, let me add useEffect. And of course, the import for useEffect was added. And as a parameter to useEffect, we need to pass a callback. And this is something I want to only happen once, right? The code that we're going to write in useEffect is something that I only want to happen when the component loads, only once. So to specify that, we can pass a second parameter, and this is the dependency list. This is the list of variables that will cause the callback, that is the first parameter, to rerun. But since I only want it to run once when the component loads, I'm going to pass here an empty dependency list. And this way I know that this callback is only going to run once when the component loads. Now, what do we want this callback to do? So basically we want it to fetch the to-do items. So this is what we did in the onClick event of the button. But this code is asynchronous, and we cannot write asynchronous code directly. So here is what we're going to do. Inside the callback of useEffect, we're going to define another function. This function is going to be asynchronous. So I'm simply going to copy this code, and let's move it from the onClick event here. But the thing is that this is going to be a separate function with a different name. So I'm going to call it load to-dos, but this is only the definition of the asynchronous function. So the code that's actually going to run on useEffect, or in other words, when the component loads, is a call to this asynchronous function. So here I'm going to add a call to this function, so load to-dos, and this way useEffect itself is not asynchronous, but it calls an asynchronous function. And now I don't need the button anymore, and if we refresh the page, we can see the loading spinner, and after a while we can see no to-dos found. Let's go back to Firestore, and let's add a few documents. So auto ID, the key of the field is going to be title, and the value feed the dog. So let's save this document, and let's add another one for feed the cat. So let's save this one as well, and let's go back to our application and refresh the page again. And once again, we can see the loading spinner and then the to-do item. One thing I want to do in my main component is add heading 1, Firebase plus React. And now we can see it here. Now, if to-dos is still null, all this component does is return the loading spinner. So we can simplify this code a bit. We can start by checking if to-dos is null. And if it is, we're going to return the loading spinner, so this image. And since we now have this separate if, we can remove this check from this return. And this might be a bit simpler. What I want to work on next is the ability for the user to add new to-dos. Because right now, if we want to have a new to-do, we have to do it directly from the database. We have to go to Firebase, to Firestore in Firebase, and add the new item manually. But I want to be able to add it from here, from the React application itself. So let's add here a small heading 2 for add to-do. And now I want to add here a new form so that the user can actually add a new to-do item. So in this form, I want to have three things, three HTML elements. I want to have an input so that the user can provide the title for the new to-do item. I want to have a label so that the user knows what the input text field is for. And I also want to have a button so that the user can submit the form. And of course, the ID of the input has to match the HTML4 of the label. And this way we connect the label to this input. And now I'm going to add to the state of this component the new title. This way we can keep track of the text that the user types in here, in this text box. So here I'm going to add a state for new title. This is the new title that the user provides. Now the value of the input needs to be exactly what we have in the state. So new title, this needs to be shown here in this input. And we also need to attach a callback to the onChange event of this input field. So onChange, and the parameter of this callback is the event, let's say E, and we're going to use the updated value of the input field to update our state, to update new title using set new title. And the only thing that's missing in this form is the handling of the submission of the form. Because when we click on this button, on the add to do button, this form is going to be submitted. So here, I'm going to handle the onSubmit event, and here is what we're going to do after the user submits the form. First, we want to prevent the default behavior of the form, because by default, when we submit an HTML form, we get a page refresh, and we don't want a full page refresh here. So I'm going to prevent the default behavior of the form, and this is something we can do with event.preventDefault. And now we can do the actual work of adding the new to-do item. So here I'm going to call add_doc. And we can see it here in Firebase Firestore. So let's choose this option. And we can see here that it was added to the imports. And as a parameter to add_doc, we first need to pass the collection reference. And as you might remember, we have it here. This is our to-do collection reference. So this is going to be the first parameter. And the second parameter is going to be an object. And this is where we specify the fields of the document that we are about to add. So we're going to start with only one field, which is going to be the title for the new to-do item. And the value of the title is exactly what we have here in the new title state. So let's take new title and use it as the value for the new document. And add_doc is an asynchronous function, and this is why here I'm going to add await. So let's try to use our new form. And here I'm going to type in for the title, visit the cow. And let's try to add the to-do. And we cannot see anything here yet. But let's go to the Firestore website. And we can see that our collection was already updated, and now we have 3 documents here. And this one is exactly the new one that we just added, visit the cow. So this works well, and we can actually add new to-do items. The thing is that the user experience is not the best, because right now, I have to refresh my page in order to be able to see the updated list, right? Now I can see the new to-do item, visit the cow, but having to refresh the page is of course not the best user experience. So let's see how we can trigger a list update right after adding the new to-do item. So here I'm going to take this method, and this is the code that we're using to fetch the current list from Firestore. This gets all of the documents from the to-dos collection. All we're going to do is call this function after adding the new item. And this way we will be able to fetch everything, including the new item. But of course it cannot be inside the use effect. We need this function to be accessible outside of use effect, so I'm simply going to move it here. And here, after adding the new document, I'm going to add a call to load to-dos. And let's try to add a new item, say take out the trash. And if I add the to-do item, we need to wait for a second, and we can see it added to the list. The thing is that this approach, even though it's working, it's not optimal. And actually it's quite wasteful. And there are 2 reasons for that. First is increased latency. And this is because the way it's implemented now, the update of the list requires a full round trip. We send the request to Firestore, right? When we're calling this function load to-dos, we're asking for the updated documents in the collection, and then Firestore sends back the updated list. The second problem with this approach is the pricing model of Firestore, because when working with Firestore, we pay by the document. And here, we're fetching all of the documents, even though we only have one new document. So we don't really need to fetch all of them anew. For this kind of tasks, the recommended approach is to use Firestore real-time snapshots. So let's see how we can use them. The natural place to create the snapshot listener is here, inside use effect, because this code runs when the component loads, and it only runs once. So this place is a very good fit to place the snapshot listener. First, we need to create a query to our collection, and we do that using the query function. So here we can see query in Firebase Firestore. This is the one we're going to use. And up here, we can see that it was added to the imports. And what we need to pass as a parameter to query is the collection reference. So to do collection reference, and let's store the result in a local constant. And now we can add a call to onSnapshot. So onSnapshot takes 3 parameters. The first one is the query we just created, and this is how we connect our listener to this specific collection. The second parameter is the actual callback, and this callback will run whenever a change to the collection is detected. This callback has one parameter called snapshot, and snapshot already contains what we get from getDocs. So when we are working with a real-time snapshot, we don't need to call getDocs anymore because we already have the collection data in the snapshot parameter. So I'm going to take these 2 lines and move them from this function to our real-time listener, move them here. But now we don't need to find the collection data ourselves because we already have it in the snapshot. So here I'm going to write snapshot. And the third parameter to onSnapshot is an error handler. So this is another callback that takes care of errors. So it has one parameter which is the error. And if we encountered an error, we're simply going to log it. And now that we are working with a snapshot, we can get rid of this function, of the load TODOs function. And also in useEffect itself, we don't need to call it anymore. And the same thing here. Whenever we add a new document, our real-time listener will detect the change, and we will have the updated data, including the new item, in our updated snapshot. So once again, from here, I can remove the call to load TODOs, and now we can even delete the import to getDocs. So this code is simpler, cleaner, more efficient, and also significantly cheaper to run on Firestore. Now, one thing we should know when working with real-time snapshots is that we should unsubscribe. This is the responsible thing to do. So generally speaking, the point in time in which we need to unsubscribe from the snapshot is when the component unmounts. Basically, when we are done using this component. And to catch this point in time, to catch the point in which the component unmounts, we can use useEffect. So the very same thing we have here, the callback of useEffect, it can return another callback. And the callback we are returning from useEffect is the one that will run when the component unmounts. So it looks this way. Here at the end of useEffect, I'm going to add return. And I'm going to return a function or a callback. And what this function is going to do is unsubscribe. Now, how do we do that? So onSnapshot itself returns a value, and this value is the unsubscription function. So let's store this function in a local constant, and I called it TODO unsub, because this is the function that allows us to unsubscribe from the TODOs snapshot. And now that we have this function, we can simply call it in this callback, and this is what we are returning from useEffect. So this will run when the component unmounts, and this way we are unsubscribing from the snapshot. So we already know how to add new TODO items, and we can also see the updates to these items. So I can add here, for example, a new one, and as soon as I add this new TODO item, I can see the updated list here. I now want to move on to working with authentication using Firebase Authentication. So this is something we're going to do in our main file. So let's switch over to app.jsx, this file, and let's start with the updated user interface. So I basically want to have here in my page 2 forms. One for sign up and another one for login to allow an existing user to sign in. So let me write the code here, and here we can see the 2 new forms, and let's see how I did that. So I basically wrote here 2 functions. One is called show sign up form, the other one is called show login form. And at the moment there isn't really too much to it. Basically it's only HTML. So here I have heading 2 that's saying sign up a new user, and then we have our form. And this form, this is the one that we can see here, it has 3 inputs. One for the user email, another one for the password, and another one, a third one for the confirm password. And we also have a label for each of these inputs. In a similar fashion, we have the show login form, that's the one that we see here. It has its own heading 2 that says login an existing user. And this is another form element. And this form has 2 input elements, one for the email and another one for the password. And each of the input elements has its own label. And here at the bottom, just before using the TODOs component, I'm using both of my functions, and this is what causes these 2 forms to show up on the page. Now, the thing is that I don't want both of these forms to show up at the same time. I don't want my page to show both of these forms at the same time. So I want to allow the user to toggle between the forms. This way they will be able to either log in or sign up, but they will not see both of the options at the same time. So to do that, here, we're going to define a state, and this state will determine if the form that's currently shown is the one for sign up or the one for log in. So let's add to our state a new state, and I'll call it auth option or authentication option. And actually this one, the account state, is something that we don't really need, so let's replace it. And now I have a state for the auth option, which is expected to be either login, this is the initial value, or sign up. And my goal is to only show the first form, the sign up form, if the value of auth option is sign up, and only show this other form, the login form, if the current value of auth option is login. So to allow the user to make this selection, I want here, just above these two forms, to have two radio buttons. And these two radio buttons are the ones that will allow the user to toggle between their selection and decide which of the forms is the one that will be shown. So I added the two radio buttons, but at the moment they are not connected, they are not related to each other, and this is why I can check both of them at the same time. If I want both of them to belong to the same radio button group, they need to have the same name. So I'm going to assign the same name to both of them. And now I can either choose this one or this one, but not both of them at the same time. We should probably also add a label to the right of each of them so it's clear for the user which one is for login and which one is for sign up. So I added these two labels, one for login, one for sign up, and of course I had to add HTML4. So this HTML4 has the same value as the ID of this input, and this HTML4 has the same value as this ID. Now I want these radio buttons to be controlled elements. I want the React state to control their current state. And this is why the checked state of these two inputs, whether or not they are selected, is going to be determined by this, by our auth option state. So here I'm going to add the checked attribute for both of them, and it's going to be determined by this state. So if auth option is login, the first one, the first radio button, is going to be checked. And if, on the other hand, auth option is equal sign up, then the second radio button is going to be checked. Now, because I initialized auth option with the value login, I can see that the first one is checked. But if I update it and change the value to sign up, we can see that the second one is checked. Now, of course, we also have to add for both of the radio buttons the onChange event so that we can detect changes made by the user and update the state accordingly. So I also added a value for each of the inputs. The value of the first radio button is login, the value of the second radio button is sign up. And I also attached a callback to the onChange event for both of them. And what I'm doing in this callback is calling setAuthOption to update the current value of auth option. Now, if the first radio button is checked, it means that the value of auth option needs to be login. And if, on the other hand, the second radio button is the one that's checked, the value of auth option needs to be sign up, which is exactly the value of the second radio button, and then this is the one that will be checked. So now I can make my selection, choose either this or that, and the value of auth option will update accordingly. And now that we have in our state the current value of auth option, it's going to be quite easy to show only one of the forms, either this or that. So in both of my functions, I'm going to check the current value of auth option. So this form, for example, only needs to be shown if the current value of auth option is sign up. So here I'm going to add a condition. So only if auth option equals sign up, I'm going to return this. I'm going to show this form. And in a similar fashion, here I'm going to add another condition, and this condition is if auth option is login. So only if auth option is login, I'm going to show this other form. And now if I choose sign up, I can see this form, the sign up form, and if I choose login, I can see the login form. Next, I want to add states for each of the inputs, right? So the user can provide their email, their password, and also for the sign up, they can provide the email, the password, and the password confirmation. So here in my state, I'm going to add 5 more states. 2 for the login, for the email and password of the login, and 3 for the sign up, for the email, password, and password confirmation for the sign up. So I now have sign up email, sign up password, and sign up confirmation password. And then for the login, I have login email and login password. And now I want these inputs to be controlled elements. So I'm going to add a value for each of them, and the value is going to keep track of what we currently have in our state. So for example, here, this is the sign up email. This is going to keep track of this value, the sign up email that we defined here. So let me add a value, and the value is going to be just that, sign up email. And I'll also do the same thing for the rest of the inputs. Okay, so we can see that the value of this input is sign up email, what we have here. The value of this input is sign up password. This is this state. And the value of this input is sign up confirmation password. And this is what we defined here. And we also have the same thing for this input and for this input. And now we also have to, of course, attach functions to the onChange events so that if the user actually goes ahead and changes any of these inputs in any of the forms, our state is going to update accordingly, and this way the component will know the current value, the updated values for each of the inputs that the user provided. So let's start with the first one. So here I'm going to add the onChange event. So if the user now changes the sign up email, this callback is going to run, and the thing it's going to do is call set sign up email. And using this function, we can update the sign up email state. So let me do the same thing for the rest of the inputs. So I'll create the onChange event for each of them. And now I have onChange for this, and for the sign up password, for the confirmation password, and I also have them for the login form. So login email and login password. So now that we have the forms, let's see how we can actually use them to sign up or to create a new user. So first we need to go to the Firebase website. And this is of course a different category, a different service that's offered by Firebase. It's not part of Firestore. Firestore is only for the database. So once again, we need to click on build. And this time we're going to choose authentication. And to be able to get started with Firebase authentication, we need to click here on get started. So get started. And it initializes the authentication service. And now, as you can see, Firebase supports quite a lot of providers. For this tutorial, I'm going to go with email and password. It's quite useful and it involves the least amount of steps. And on top of that, you don't rely on any third-party service. But if later on you want to incorporate another authentication service, such as Google, for example, it's going to be very, very similar, so the transition is not hard at all. But as I said, for this tutorial, we are going to go with email password. So this is what I'm going to choose. And let's enable it. You can also use passwordless using email link, but I'm not going to do this now. And let's save. Okay, now under sign in methods, we can see that we have email password, but I want to go to users. And at the moment, we don't have any users yet, but now we're going to see how to create new users using our sign up form. So let's get back to the code and let's start with a sign up form. Here it is. And what I want to do now is add to this form, to the sign up form, the handling of the onSubmit event. And we're going to have here an asynchronous function. And as you can see, this callback has a parameter called EV for the event of the submission. The first thing we need to do is to prevent the default behavior of the HTML form, because by default, HTML forms, when submitted, are causing a page refresh. And in our case, we don't want a page refresh, so I'm going to prevent the default behavior. And now I want to show here a very simple client-side form validation. So I only want to verify two things. First, I want to make sure that the password is at least 6 characters. If it's less than 6 characters, it's considered too short. And on top of that, before actually submitting the form, I want to verify, I want to make sure that the password and the password confirmation are equal. If they are not the same, if they are different, I don't even want to submit the form, I don't even want to send the request to Firebase. Now, the value of the password, the value that the user provided for the sign up form can be found here, sign up password. So let's make sure that it is long enough and also that it is equal to what we have here in the sign up confirmation password. And if this is the case, we need to actually create the user. But first I want to handle the case that this is not the case. And if the password is wrong, for example, it's too short or the password does not match the password confirmation, I want to show here a short error message. So to do that, I'm going to add to my state another state, and this is for showing the password problem, the password error. And I called it show password problem, and of course it also has the set show password problem. And if we encounter the problem with the password here on the submission of this form, I'm going to set the show password problem to true. But I only want it to be shown for 1 second, so I'm going to use set timeout to turn it off after 1 second. So after 1 second, we're going to set show password problem to false. And now we should do something with show password problem. If it's on, it should show the error message. So in the sign up form, just above the submission button right here, I want to add a paragraph showing the requirements for the password. And if we switch to the sign up form, we can see it here. So this is how it looks like, and as you can see, it's red. The thing is that I don't necessarily want to show it. I only want to show it if show password problem is true. So here, before actually showing this paragraph, I want to make sure that show password problem is true. And now this paragraph will only be shown if show password problem is true indeed. So this is how we can do simple client-side validation. But now let's go back here and see how we can actually sign the user up. So the function we're going to use is create user with email and password. This is how it's called. So create user with email and password. Here it is, and you can see that it's from Firebase Auth. Let's choose this one. And up here, we can see that it was imported from Firebase Auth. And now, as parameters to this function, we need to pass 3 parameters. The first one is going to be auth. And auth, as you might remember, is what we defined here in our config file in config Firebase. So once again, an import was added. And let's take a quick look at this file. Here it is. So this is our Firebase configuration. And down here, we're exporting auth, which is get auth of the application. And this is the first parameter we need to pass to create user with email and password. The second parameter is the email of the user. So in our case, it's simply going to be this sign up email. And the third parameter is the password that the user is going to use. And in our case, it's going to be sign up password. Now, this function is asynchronous, and this is why here I'm going to add await. And let's say that after a successful sign up, after the user actually registered, I want to show them the login form so that they can use their new registration and log into their website. And this is why here I'm going to set the authentication option to login, and let's try to use it. So let's provide some email here, and I'm just going to go with some fake email here. And we also need to provide the password and to confirm the password, and let's sign up. And we can see that immediately the application is now showing us the login form. And now let's go back to Firebase. And if we refresh this page, we can see that under users, we now have a new user, which is exactly the user we signed up with. So now our system, our Firebase authentication system, has a new user. Next up, I want us to see how to actually perform the login to an existing user. So down here on the login form, I want to handle the submission of this form. So let's bind a callback to the onSubmit event. And once again, it's going to be an asynchronous function. And once again, I'm going to start with prevent default because I don't want the default behavior of the HTML form. Next, I want to actually sign in. And this is something we're going to do with the function sign in with email and password. And here it is, sign in with email and password under Firebase Auth authentication. And once I choose that, we can see that it was added to the imports. Here it is. And once again, this function expects 3 parameters. The first one is auth for the authentication configuration. The second one is the email for the user. And when the user types in their email in this box, we have this variable to update, the login email. So this is what we're going to send as the email for the login. And the third parameter is the password. And once again, we have this in our state, and this is going to be the login password. And this is also an asynchronous method. So once again, we need await. And this will allow us to log in. Now, after logging in, we're going to get back an object. So let's store this object temporarily. And I name this constant CRUD for credentials. And let's start simple by logging it. So let's try to log in with the same user we just created. And as you remember, this is the email. So this is the one that we're going to use. And I need to type in the password that I chose. And let's open the developer tools. And when we actually log in by clicking on this button, we can see the credentials object coming back from Firebase. Now, this object that just returned can be quite useful because if we look at it carefully, we can see that here we have the user object, and among the fields of this user, we have the email. And this way, our application can know the email of the user that just signed in. So let's try to show it. Let's try to use it in our actual application. Let's start by updating our state. And here I'm going to have a state for the credentials of the currently logged in user. So I simply called it credentials, and this will be the credentials of the current user. Now, right after the user logs in, so here in the login form, instead of logging the credentials, we are going to update our state. So instead of console.log, it's going to be set credentials. And now our state was updated. And let's simply use it to show the email of the user down here, just above the TODOs. So here, right above the TODOs, I'm going to add an heading 3. And this is going to show credentials, which is what we have in the state of the component, dot user, dot email. Now, as you can see, right now the application fails to load because currently credentials is still null. So when we are trying to access its user property, it fails. And this is why I want to start by making sure that credentials is not null. So if it is not null, we can go ahead and show the email of the user. But if it is null, I'm simply going to show guest. So right now we see in this heading 3 guest. And this is because credentials wasn't updated yet. But now let's try to log in again. So let me type in the password and log in. And we can see that now it was updated, and now we can see the actual email of the user that just logged in. But it turns out that just like we saw that it's much more efficient and convenient to work with snapshots when dealing with Firebase Firestore with a database, it applies also to authentication with Firebase. So once again, I'm going to use a real-time snapshot, and this real-time snapshot will detect changes to the current authentication state. So basically whether or not the user is logged in. And the best place to register to this kind of real-time snapshots is with use effect. So let's define use effect to this main component, and let me place it here. And once again, this is something that I only want to happen once, so the dependency list is going to be empty. And this way I know that this use effect will only run when the component loads or mounts. So to register to this snapshot, to the authentication snapshot, we need onAuth state changed. Here it is, onAuth state changed. It can be found under Firebase Authentication. And of course the import was added. This function expects two parameters. The first one is auth, the authentication configuration. The second one is a callback, where the parameter of this callback is the new user, or the current user, the user that just logged in. Now, there are two options, of course. This user, this current user, can be null if no user signed in, and this can happen, for example, when the application just loads in the first time. Or it can be an actual user. And if it is an actual user, then current user will be different than null. So if current user is a real user, is an actual user, we're going to update our state. This is what we did before after login. Do you remember? Here, after a successful login, we used to update the state, but now we're not going to need it anymore because the snapshot will take care of it for us. So it's going to be set credentials, current user, but I want to emphasize an important difference here. As you can see, this is already the user. What we did here in login was actually a bit different because here it was the entire credentials object whose one of its properties was the user. And here with the snapshot, it's even simpler because we already have the user object itself. So we don't have to dig in to find the user. What we get back from the snapshot is the actual user. So here in the login, I'm going to remove the update of the state because this is already done with the snapshot. And we probably don't even need this constant as well. And here, instead of guest, we want to show the email of the current user. But now, as I said, we don't have to dig in to find the user. We have the user in the state itself because this is what's coming back from the snapshot. So I'm going to remove .user and let's refresh the page. And we can see that we are already logged in. So I didn't have to log in again. The application remembers the application is well aware of the current user and it knows that it is already logged in. And this is why the email is already shown here. By the way, I want to show you something interesting. Let's open the developer tools, and here I'm going to change to the application tab, and under storage we can see indexed DB. Let's expand this, and here we can see Firebase local storage DB. All of the information that Firebase manages or holds in the browser is here. So what I'm going to do now is delete database, and I need to approve. And if I refresh the page now, you will see that once again I'm going to be a guest. So let's refresh, and we can see here guest. So let me log in again. So let's log in, and now I can see the email. Now I can close the application, reopen it in a different tab, whatever I want, right? So I can, for example, refresh, and I am still logged in. But if I delete the Firebase database on the browser, then the information for the current user that is currently held in this database in the browser is going to be removed, and then the browser will not have the information about the current user, and we will have to re-log in or to log in again. Now, just like we did when we worked with a database snapshot, also when working with the authentication snapshot, we should unsubscribe. So back here, where we register to the snapshot, this function returns another function, another callback, and I want to store this callback in a local constant. And when this component unmounts, and this is an event that we can catch with a return value of use effect, I want to call the unsubscription function. And the behavior will not change, but this is the responsible thing to do. And let me remove the centering from the CSS so that all of the to-do items will start from the left and will be aligned. And now I want to create better separation between the authentication and the actual data, because here we are showing actual data, and right now it's combined with the authentication, such as sign-ups and logins. I want to have it in a different view, because the next step would be to personalize these to-dos. I want to have different to-dos for different users. So let's start by making this separation. So the first thing I'm going to do is to remove this heading 3, this one, because this is something that we're going to move to the to-do component, so I'll remove it from here. And now, if we think about it, all of this code is related to authentication, because here in the beginning we have the selection of either login or sign up, and then we're actually showing the relevant form. This, on the other hand, the usage of the to-dos component, this is related to the actual data. So what I'm going to do is check if the user is currently signed in. If the user is signed in, then I don't want to show anything that's related to authentication because the user is already signed in. On the other hand, if the user is not signed in, I don't want to show any of the data because the TODOs component only needs to be shown if the user is already logged in so that we can show their to-do items. And here's how we're going to do that. We're going to hide the part that's irrelevant. Now we can know the current state using our state because we have credentials, and this can be either null or not null. If credentials is null, it means that no user is logged in, but if credentials is different than null, it means that it is an actual user and a user already logged in. So we are going to use exactly this, exactly the credentials state, and I'm only going to show the TODOs component if credentials is not null, is different than null. And now I will only see the TODOs for logged in users. This, on the other hand, needs to use the negative condition. So if credentials is null, I want to show everything that's related to authentication. So let's add the condition here. And let me wrap all of these elements in another dummy element. And this, the heading 1, probably should be shown anyway. So let me remove this and put this here at the top. And let's close these curly braces. So now, if credentials is null and the user is not logged in, we will see this part of the component that has to do with authenticating the user, with logging in. If, on the other hand, credentials is not null, it's an actual user that's already logged in, we are going to show the TODOs component that shows the actual data. So we immediately only see the data. We don't see anything that has to do with authentication. But once again, if I open the developer tools and delete the Firebase local storage database, so let's delete it, I can refresh my page, and now I only see things that are related to authentication. It might be signing up a new user or logging in an existing user, but we don't see the actual data. And now, as I said, I want the TODOs to be personalized. I want them to be different for different users. And this is why the TODOs component, let's open it. This shows the data of one specific user, and this is why I want to move here, the H3, the heading 3 that shows the email of the currently logged in user. So let me put it here at the top, and it's going to be H3. And this raises a question. How are we going to get the email of the user in this component? And I think that the easiest solution is to use props for this component. So I'm going to add to this component a credentials prop right here. And I'm going to assume that this is already the actual user. Do you remember the one that we got from the snapshot, from the authentication snapshot? And this is why here it's going to be relatively simple. We simply need to access these credentials, which represent the user, .email. And let me also add here a few explanation words. So it's showing the TODOs of this user. And now, since this component expects this prop, we should probably send a value to this prop. So in the main component, app.jsx, when I'm using the component, I need to pass a value for credentials. So credentials is going to be equal to exactly what we have in our state, because this is what we are updating when changes are detected for the authentication status. So this is what I'm going to use and send to the other component. So this is going here. Let's log back in. So log in. And now I want to add here a sign out button. This is relatively simple when working with Firebase, especially when using the authentication snapshot. So let's start by actually placing the button. And I want it here, right after we are showing the email of the user. And this button needs to say sign out. And let's also add a horizontal line between this button and the actual to-do items. And upon clicking on the button, so on the on-click event, all I'm going to do is sign out. And as you can see, we can find here sign out from Firebase Authentication. So let's choose this option. And of course, it was added to the imports. And we need to pass a parameter to sign out. So let's wrap it in a callback, in a function. And the parameter is going to be auth, which is the authentication configuration, the one we defined in config Firebase. And that's it. This will sign the currently logged in user out. Now, because we already have the authentication snapshot in place, do you remember here, we already have this. It will detect the change, it will detect the sign out of the user, and our state will immediately update accordingly. But what we are missing here is to take care of the case in which the current user is now null, because if the user signed out, current user is going to be null. This is the parameter of the callback of the snapshot. And it needs to return the currently logged in user. But if no user is logged in, and after a sign out no user will be logged in, current user is going to be null. And currently we're only taking care of the case that current user is different than null. So let's add handling to the case in which current user is null. And what I'm going to do in this case is set the credentials to null. And this is because we are using credentials to decide if to show the stuff that's related to the authentication or the actual data, the actual to-do items for the user. And this is why I'm simply going to set credentials to null. And now the application should update successfully. So let's try to sign out. And once again, we immediately see the login screen. And this is working pretty well now. I can, for example, copy this URL of this page and, for example, open the application in a different tab. So let's open it here. And let's log in this tab. So log in. And I can now see the to-do items here. And if we're now going back to the first tab, okay, it already updated automatically. And it should also work the other way around. So let's sign out in this tab. And if we're now moving to the other tab, we can see that we are logged out in this one as well. The only thing that's missing is to complete the CRUD set. So I want to show how we can update existing to-do items and also how to delete to-do items. Let's start with updating existing ones. So let's start by logging in. And I want to show a small checkbox to the left of each of these items. So in our to-dos component, right here, where we are building the div for each of the to-do items, we need to improve it a bit. We need to expand it a bit. Let's start by showing checkboxes, a checkbox for each of the items. And the title, the actual title, will be the label for the checkbox. So it looks pretty similar to what it looked before, but now we actually have an input, which is a checkbox, and a label. So I want to start by assigning an ID to each of the inputs so that we can use this ID for the HTML4 of the corresponding label. And for the ID, I'm simply going to use the same thing we used for the key, which is the ID of the current to-do. So let's assign the different IDs and the HTML4 for the labels. And now I want each of the elements, each of the to-do items to also have a completed property. On top of the title, which shows what the to-do actually is, I also want to know if it is either completed or not, so that we know whether or not the checkbox needs to be checked. So the first thing I want to do is when creating a new to-do item, I want to set its completed value. Right here, when we are adding a new document, I don't only want to assign the title for it, I also want to assign the completed property for it. So completed, and I'm simply going to start it with the value false. And this way, new documents will always start as incomplete. And now here, where we are extracting or retrieving the information, the data for each of the to-do items, we have all of the information in the snapshot, but currently we're only taking the ID of the document and the title from the document. But now we have this additional piece of information. We might have the completed field. Now we could add another key value pair to the object that we are building here. This is completely valid. But I want to show you a more general alternative that's quite widely used. And this is to take all of the data object, right? Here we have an object. This is why we could access its title field. So I'm going to take all of this object, doc.data, but it will not work this way because the ID is not part of the data. We need the ID in addition to this object, to the data object. And this is why I'm going to use here the spread operator. This will take all of the key value pairs from this object, from the data object. So it will add all of the information from this object to the new object that we are building. And it will also add to this object the ID. And this way the new object will have all of the information that the data object had. And on top of that, it will also have the ID. And this way we know for sure that our document will have both the title and the completed state. Now, to decide whether or not a checkbox needs to be checked, we need to check its completed property. Now, the to-do items that we currently have in the database don't have this property, but it will work anyway. It is a bit of a problem, but it will be okay. So here I'm going to set the checked attribute, and this is going to be the completed of the current to-do item, so to-do.completed. And now I want to add the onChange event to the checkboxes, because when the user clicks on any of them, we need to change the completed property of this task, of this to-do item. So let's add here onChanged, and here we're going to have an asynchronous function, and the callback for the onChange event has this parameter, the event parameter. And now we need to update an existing document. This is a bit different than what we have done, because before we created new documents, but now we want to update an already existing document. So first we need to retrieve the current document. This can be done using the doc function. So let's try to find it. And here it is, doc at Firebase Firestore. So let's use this function. And of course the import for the function was added here. And this function takes two parameters. First is the collection reference, right? Because we have our collection reference, our to-do collection reference. This is the first parameter we need to pass. And the second parameter is the ID of the specific document in this collection. And this is simply going to be todo.id. And now we have a reference to this specific document. So let's store it in a local constant. And now we are going to be able to update this document. This is something we can do with the function updateDoc. And here it is, updateDoc at Firebase Firestore. And once again, the import was added. and here it is. So the first parameter we need to pass to update doc is the document reference. We have it here, our to-do document reference. This is going to be the first parameter. The second parameter is an object. Now this does not have to be all of the properties, all of the field of the document. It can definitely be a partial update. So here, for example, I don't want to change the title, I only want to change the checked property. So this is the only one, the only property that I'm going to pass. If you compare it to here, when we called add doc, we had to pass all of the properties we wanted in this new document. But here we are updating an existing document, so we can definitely only pass a subset of its properties. So completed is going to be the updated state of the checkbox, which we can find from the event.target.checked. So let's try, for example, to check the first checkbox, and let's go to the Firestore website. So let's go back to Firestore. And here we can see the updated document, and indeed, in addition to the title, we also have here in this document the completed field, and its value is true. If I now uncheck the box, so let's uncheck it and go back to the website, we can see that completed changed to false. So let's check a few of them, say this, this, and this, and let's refresh the page, and we can see that they stay checked. And let's say that I also want a line through the text of the items that are already completed. So for that, in my label, I'm going to add style, and we want to set the text decoration for this label. Now, if the current item is completed, so todo.completed, so if the item is completed, I want the style to be line through. Otherwise, I just want it to be none. And now we can see a line through the completed items. Next, I want this database, I want these items to be personalized. I want to have different items for different users. And with Firebase, this is fairly simple. All we're going to do to make this change is update our collection reference. So here, where we are defining our collection reference, I don't want it to just be to-dos. I want the collection that we're working on to be personal to the current user. So to-dos is going to stay, but it's going to be the general collection, the collection for all of the users. Inside this collection, so /, I want to have different documents for different users. And the way I'm going to do that, first I'm going to replace the quotes with backticks, and now I'm going to use the user ID for the current document. So in Firebase, every user has their own user ID. This is something that Firebase generates automatically. The user provides their email, but Firebase assigns a user ID for them. And we are going to use here this user ID. So to retrieve this user ID, we can do it from the credentials prop that we got for this component. So credentials, but this time instead of the email, it's going to be the user ID or .uid. So this is accessing a specific document for the current user. But here, when we're working with the collection function, we need to pass the path to a collection. And the way Firestore works is that documents always have to have an odd number of elements. Right now we have two, right? We have the to-dos and then the credentials.userid. So we have two elements, and this is not good for a collection reference, for a path for a collection. So what we're going to do is to create a sub-collection in this document. So here I'm going to add another /, and we can call this sub-collection, for example, items. And this is valid for a collection reference because now we have three elements, right? We have to-dos, and then we have the user ID, and then we have items. So we have three elements, and this is a valid collection reference, and we're going to have a collection. In this collection, we're going to have this document, and in the document, we're going to have a sub-collection. So the sub-collection itself is going to be items, and this is where we're going to store the to-do items of the specific user. And of course, now it doesn't find anything, so let's go back to Firestore, and let me delete all of what we have here because the entire structure is going to change. So let's delete this, delete collection, and now let's try to add a new to-do. Let's say take out the trash, and let's add to-do. And first we can see it here, but let's look again at the Firebase website, and let's refresh the page, and we can see that once again we have the to-dos collection, and in this collection we have this user ID. This is the document that we have here. The document is simply the user ID of the current user. In this document we have a sub-collection called items, and if I now click on items on this sub-collection, I can see that I have here one document, and this document, let's click on it, this document has two properties. Completed, which is false, and the title. Now let's go back here to the to-dos. The good thing about this is that now if I had a different user, they would have a different user ID. So all of their to-dos would be in a different document in this collection, in a different sub-collection. Next, I want to allow users to delete existing to-do items. So here to the right of each of the items, I want to add a trash bin. Maybe we can add another one, so if we delete the first one, we still have something. So let me add here feed the dog and add to-do. Okay, and now I want the trash bins. So first we need to configure or to install Font Awesome. I will use Font Awesome for the trash bin icons. So first, let's go to docs.fontawesome.com. So from here, docs.fontawesome.com. And if we scroll down, we can see here instructions for using with React. So this is what I'm going to choose. And we need a few things from this page. First, we need to install this. So let's copy this and run it on the project. So let's open the terminal and go in here. So this was the first one. Next, we need the SVG core. So let me copy this line and let's run it as well. So this is going here. And the third one, I'm not going to use an icon package. I'm simply going to go with a simpler option, which is SVG icon packages. And we're only going to use the free solid ones. This is what we're going to need for the trash bin icon. So let me copy this and let's install this as well. So this goes here. And now everything that we need is installed. So let me open my package.json file. Okay, and now under dependencies, we can see the 3 packages that we installed. So this is the prerequisite. This is fine. And now I want the trash bin icons to be in a button. So let's start by adding this button. So here in our todos.map, we're currently showing the input for the checkbox and then the label for the actual text. And right after the label, I want my button. Now, I don't want actual text in my button. I want the Font Awesome icon. So we're going to use a Font Awesome component, and it's going to look like this, Font Awesome. And here it is, Font Awesome icon from Font Awesome React Font Awesome. And it was imported, of course. And as a prop to this component, we need to specify the actual icon that we want to use. So icon, and they always have the FA prefix, so FA, and the one I want is trash. Here it is, FA trash from free solid SVG icons. Let's choose this option. And now we can see our trash bin icon to the right of each of the elements. Now, in order for these icons to actually do something, I want to add the onClick event to this button. And here is what I want to do when the user actually clicks on one of these icons. First, I want to find the document reference. The exact same document reference that we needed to update an existing document, we're going to use the same one. So I'm just going to copy it from here. This is our to-do document reference. And once again, this refers to one specific document from the entire collection. But this time, instead of updating the document, we want to delete it. So this time we're going to use the function delete doc. And here it is, delete doc from Firebase Firestore. Let's choose this. And just like before, the first parameter is going to be the document reference, so to-do doc reference. And this time, this is the only parameter. We don't need to pass any other parameter. And that's basically it. We can now click on the delete icon, and the to-do item is immediately removed. Let's also delete this one, and all of the to-do items were removed.